Okay, let's get started. So first of all, I want to welcome you to our second webinar related to elections and you. I see a few of you today attending, also joined us yesterday afternoon to learn the basics of election law. I'm Amy Miller, Director of Alumni and Donor Relations and Associate Director for Enrollment at Cleveland State University, Cleveland Marshall College of Law. Today's topic is vitally important as it deals with a long-standing and often systematically racist policy that prevents those with a felony conviction from voting forever. Even after serving their sentences, returning to society, and being upstanding citizens, neighbors, and friends, they are still denied the right to vote. While there are some states that have attempted to lift this specific voter suppression tactic, most recently Florida's citizens in a referendum, legislatures have continued to restrict voting. I'm very pleased to have two speakers join us today to talk about this common type of voter suppression and share their experiences. First, we have Crystal Bryan, is the Director of the Office of Reentry for Cuyahoga County. She has over 17 years experience working in the public sector, from reentry administrator, prosecuting attorney, forensic adult program specialist at the Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services Board, and direct service to clients as a drug court case manager, residential treatment therapist, and vocational coordinator. Crystal is a graduating fellow of Just Leadership USA and New Leaders Council. She has served as an advisory board member for Cleveland Young Professional Senate, Secretary and Community Engagement Chair for Norman S. Minor Bar Association, board member of Greater Cleveland Drug Court, volunteer for the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, and co-founder of Cleveland Votes. But most importantly, she is a 2011 graduate of this great law school, Cleveland Marshall College of Law, and a Cleveland State University graduate. Our second presenter is Damian Calvert. He is an outreach supervisor for the City of Cleveland's Community Relations Board, where he coordinates information and activities for grassroots organizations focused on violence, gang interruption, and reduction and safety initiatives. Damian can speak personally about this subject after having been incarcerated for 18.5 years. He uses this experience to help others on the cusp of facing the same fate learn the lessons he has. While incarcerated, he founded and served as inaugural president of Grafton's NAACP branch, became a certified American Red Cross instructor, served as management director of Junior Chamber of Commerce, and mentored at-risk adolescents coming into the facility. Since his release, he's been a movement-building organizer for the Ohio Organizing Campaign, policy advocate coordinator at Luther Metropolitan Ministries, and a research associate at Case Western Reserve University's Social Justice Initiative. Clearly, we have two expert presenters today to share their perspective on voter suppression of formerly incarcerated persons and how we should all be concerned about this. Remember, if you have any questions during the program, and I hope you do, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer your questions at the end. I'll turn it over to Crystal and Damian now.
Well, thank you, Amy. We
You're
appreciate
welcome.
that very esteemed introduction for the both of us. I certainly don't know about expert, but I hope to be able to inform and advise you all of things you did not know today. You'll be able to carry out into the community and you'll be able to activate. Damian is the only expert here because he's the only one with any lived experience of any form of suppression in this particular space for those who are formerly incarcerated. So the way we're going to kind of present this flow today, we want to make sure we answer three particular questions. We want you to know, one, who we are. We want you to know, two, how we got here. And the last thing is three, how do you activate in this particular space? We can't leave you without the charge of action. So, I will take the first question and then pass it over to Damian to respond. And then same thing, that will be kind of the flow. We'll start with two, and then Damian will respond to two, and then lastly, we'll get to three. It sounds like per Amy's instruction, we may not have to utilize the entire time. We are thankful for the two individuals that are here with us. So a small number is still a great number, especially if you can have a movement. It's not quantity, it's quality of those who are here to serve, right? All right, so let's start and talk a little bit about who we are. I should probably tell you I speak really fast too. So Damian knows. Since I can't see you, I can only see Damian or Amy. You may have to tell me during this webinar if I'm moving too fast, and you have to give me the cue. And that's the key. That's the slow it down cue. So who we are. Amy gave a wonderful introduction, but essentially I want to take a little bit of time to tell you about really who the office is and what the Office of Reentry does. So again, my name is Crystal Bryant. I currently serve as the director of our Cuyahoga County Office of Reentry. Our Office of Reentry is hosted under the auspices of Health and Human Services. We have 7 divisions or sister agencies. Some of them, they may be more familiar to you, as an Office of Child Support Services or a Job and Family Services who provides public benefits such as Medicaid and food assistance. Our Senior Adult Services and our Homeless Division are one of some of the few of those total of 8 divisions that we have under Health and Human Services. So as an Office of Reentry, you may say, well, what do you do? Well, that depends on what state and what county you are in, but this particular Office of Reentry is primarily a funder. So what does a funder do? A funder gives money. We supplant financial resources in our community to various nonprofits, sometimes law schools, sometimes for-profit institutions, to create space for those returning home from incarceration into the community can not just return, but to also thrive and advance. We are also a connector. We're a convener, we're an influencer, and we're a thought leader on all things reentry. So it's really important for me to kind of start out and tell you about what we've done in this space since I've taken over or I've assumed this role. I've been in this space for almost 4 years. December 27th would mark 4 years in this particular position. But I started working with the Office of Reentry during its inception, when the first director had the charge of implementing and executing this particular task from the 13 original recommendations that community stakeholders got together and put in form to say, hey, what do we want to do about this issue of reentry? So it's really important for to talk about this piece of it, because a lot of the times when you think about solving or tackling reentry, you think about the definition of reentry, which for all intents and purposes is really just the transition from incarceration back into the community. And as long as we consistently tackle that definition, we never really hit its core issues. And so what happens? Well, we have people recidivating constantly. You may hear that we have in Cuyahoga County the highest recidivism rates of people going in and out of institutions. And so sometimes you often get apathetic about it, and you may think, well, we put all these stops in place, all these programs, all this workforce, we've invested all this money, and there's opportunity, and people simply aren't utilizing it. So you get to some of those approaches about, well, then what works? What stops people from committing crimes? And so it's really important for us to begin to focus on systematic solutions and not programmatic. And that's why we kind of shifted away from tackling a definition, but in fact, looking at the core issues of what creates recidivism and what produces the lack of opportunity and access that people have that keep them going in and out, the lack of education, the lack of civic engagement, and ultimately the lack of belief in one's self. So we'll be able to kind of tackle and touch on some of those things as we talk about voter suppression, because they are definitely one and the same. They're intermingled, and we'll give a little bit of background and history lesson as to why. So I'd like to turn it over now to our esteemed chair of our Greater Cleveland Reentry Leadership Coalition, Damian Calvert.
Thank you, Crystal, and thanks for being invited into this space. So I'm Damian Calvert. I'm the supervisor of the outreach team out of the City of Cleveland's Community Relation Board. As a supervisor, I oversee the implementation of the violence interruption model for the City of Cleveland, which I also work with grassroots organizations coordinating activities and the flow of information between those grassroots organizations geared toward violence reduction, City Hall, and law enforcement. It's a very interesting space to be in. As my professor, Tim Black, out of the Social Justice Institute, once said, he once described me as a cultural broker. And when I asked him, like, what's a cultural broker? He said the ability to be able to move seamlessly through different spaces. And so that's what this is about. And how appropriate to have this type of conversation at this particular time, because as Crystal said, it's interconnected and interrelated. How does violence and the things going on in the community relate to voter suppression and the like? This is something that I look forward to tying in a minute. A little bit about myself. Yes, I was incarcerated, and when I was president of the NAACP and got that organization up and running, one of the things that I've learned about voter registration and voter activation is that this is a conversation about power, about building power. And when you're somebody who's incarcerated, when you're a population who's as we learned in past, I think Krista will get into that, how they created laws, vagrancy laws and things like that to give people cases, to take away their suffrage, and to incarcerate them where they become cheap labor inside of the prisons. This is a conversation about powerlessness. And so when we talk about voter suppression, we're talking about powerlessness. And so the whole thing about tying it in is, I'm sorry, there's a fight going on over here, and I'm trying to keep my attention rested over here. Leaving the lake was a bad spot. Get back on task. So being involved in the NAACP and helping to get people engaged around the issues of the day and helping the people to who's 60 days and less getting ready to go home to get their register so that whatever their residence was going to be at, they'll have their car waiting there. That was a conversation about power. But we'll talk about that in the second question. I didn't mean to jump ahead of that. But one of the things that we learned about engaging in this type of work is subject matter expertise. And so Crystal had mentioned about me being involved in this because when we talk about reentry, having lived it, had the lived experience of trying to transition back into the community, having to live the experience of having a felony conviction on you, which is like that scarlet letter. Having to live that, there's a saying that only those of us who've been bitten by the snake can tell each other how it feels. So to find a space and to build a career around my subject matter expertise of advocacy and of motivating people into action, you know, that's like at the top of the pyramid, that's like self-actualization, and it helps give all that time I did meaning. So with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to you, Crystal, and I'm gonna change my position so I'm not distracted by going on over here.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mr. Calvert, for sharing your piece and helping our audience to better understand who you are and what you bring to this conversation in terms of your added value as a subject matter expert. So how did we get here, right? So one of the reasons why it's important to frame how we got here in terms of discussion is because suppression or oppression is rooted in the history of America. And this isn't a topic that we are touching on just now because it is oh so popular with the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many others. There have been plenty of African Americans, you know, murdered. Depends on your perception and your view of what you see and how you feel about these things. But for mine, it is murders that is not as notable, does not get as much publicity. And so the core reason at its tail is capitalism and poverty. And it sounds really crazy, right? We're going from criminal justice to capitalism and poverty, but the United States is a capitalistic country. And we know that the slavery was not about racism, right? Racism was slavery. In fact, what this country, capitalism for us is really rooted, slavery is rooted in capitalism because you needed free or cheap labor. And this is how we got here, right? And so we'll have, as we kind of go through the voter suppression issue, we'll take it back a little bit in terms of history lesson. We'll give a couple facts and statistics about numbers. I may look off screen just to make sure I'm quoting the appropriate facts here and there. I don't want to know the appropriate numbers and statistics. I don't want to give you wrong information, but it allows you to begin to think differently about this. And we're not attempting to make you commit to the way we think, but it certainly provides a different perspective if you've never thought about it in this way, or if you don't have lived experience or family members who have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system. So it may be out of your reach and harder to view in this manner. And you know, Damien touched on something that's really, really important to keep at the forefront of your mind as we go through this discussion. Voting is power, right? And it is the cheapest form of power. It doesn't require a lot of activity to have this level of power. And so a lot of effort is placed around being able to strip this power and remove it from people. And in this particular capacity, when we think about the formerly incarcerated population, it's done by law. It is done by, our federal government. It is done by our Constitution. It is preserved by our judicial system in terms of the Supreme Court. So, when you think about your transition, I'm not sure if this is the two individuals on a call are alumni or if you are students in school, but think about that call to action and what you can do about it should you feel like a change is needed and needs to happen, right? So the US is the most punitive nation in terms of criminal justice in the world. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Black Americans are incarcerated at 33%, but our makeup in the adult population is only 12%. So we are 12% of the entire United States population, yet we make up 33% of the prison population. And at some point, if you take criminal law, or depending on what your minor was, you may touch on some of these key factors and points. And so in those discussions, when they talk about philosophy and theory, they may or tend to ask, do you really think that would mean that really all the Black people here are the problem, right? We're the only ones committing crime, et cetera. And so numbers are skewed, and it depends on your perception in terms of how you tend to view them, right? Because a lot of it could be, from my perspective, the way in which, or the rate in which we are arrested, the rate in which we are convicted. That has nothing to do necessarily with our skin color, but has everything to do with maybe the breaks and flexibility that other races may get. Because it would be impossible almost for one race of people to commit this much violence, to be responsible for this many problems in the United States of America, but have such a small representation of people, right? And so what happens when you have 33% out of the 12% of the entirety they have restrictions on what they're able to do once you get this scarlet letter that Damien talked about. So Damien before you today, is a real heavy hitter. He is a real soldier, right? You hear his position and you may think, well, if he did it, everybody else can do it, but that is just not the case. Damien is the exception. He is not the rule. And I'm sure you all know about general rules versus exceptions. And he had to work really, really hard to get where he is. He's had to battle a lot to get where he is, and he consistently continues to battle a lot to maintain and elevate and grow, right? And so when you think about the fact that we're disenfranchised by that number, right? 6.1 million Americans lose their right to vote with the felony, and that was 2016 numbers. 1 in every 13 Black Americans are disenfranchised as a direct result of having a felony record in terms of being able to vote. That's a rate of 4 times greater than non-Black Americans. So when we talk about the fact that voting is power, it is the cheapest way to have power. Is one of the tools for people that are impoverished communities to be able to seek the change that they want to see, be a part of the participatory process, and be engaged in this civic democracy. And so think about that just by the fact that you had a felony record, you're not allowed to be and participate in one of the greatest things that we're giving in our democracy, and that is the vote. So it automatically strips away power, right? So we talked a little bit about the fact that it's almost an impossibility to separate felony disenfranchisement from systematic racism in the United States. It's a direct link between felony disenfranchisement and racism or systematic racism that starts all the way back from the Civil War's time period. And I know most of you probably already know this, so you don't need a huge history lesson, but there has been some things that Amy and other staff members have done to kind of put you all on the game, right? I'm using slang here, right? As you kind of transition through this process of hearing a lot more about race and equity. And they've been having viewings and showings of the 13th, which is a documentary about the 13th Amendment and what the 13th Amendment really does. And this is no different from today, right? You'll see a piece of legislation we want moved, whether it's in Congress or whether it's in our General Assembly at the state level, and you are adamant you want this, and guess what happens? They throw you a curveball because they put something else in there. And in this negotiation time, that's a tactic. So if you want this to pass and you really want this to move, I put my piece in there, whether it's about an extra railroad, $1 for something that's totally not directed or connected to this piece of legislation. But if you want this to move, then you are more likely to pass it because you know how bad you really want it. And it's a give or take game when it shouldn't be that kind of ball game. And so this has been happening since the history of the United States, right? And the 13th Amendment is just one example. So the 13th Amendment, yes, we should celebrate, right? Because it provided the opportunity to free slaves. But at the same time, it put that exception, because there's always the exception to the rule. And that one particular exception was unless you are incarcerated.
Convicted.
So, Damien, do you want to add anything to that before I keep moving through this?
Well, no, just saying, in that 13th Amendment, as you already said, Crystal, the exception in there is that slavery shall be abolished unless duly convicted. And if I may add to that, we when we deal with violence, right? And this is how this is connected. When we deal with violence, violence is a symptom, right? So when I enter conversations about violence and things like that, we first have to talk about systems. We have to talk about the systems of inequity. We have to talk about structural violence, which is the laws, which are those policies, which are those practices, official and unofficial, that bars community of colors and people below certain economic thresholds from equitable access to opportunities. This is where voter suppression and all of these things come in. This is where you have racial profiling, which targets people of color, which disproportionately locks up people of color, which creates a cradle to the prison pipeline, as coined by Miss Elderman of the Children's Defense Fund. We know that um, third grade reading scores, literacy scores, is based on, they use that information, that data, on how many beds to build in the prisons when those third graders project to turn 18. How does that all tie in? Well, that structural violence, how that ties in is that it bars people from equitable access to opportunities and representation. So during the Reconstruction period, remember, we had a lot of black, I forget how many. I think we had, what, 6 to 9 black senators. We had black mayors. We had black representatives. We had all these black people in power. But then when the Jim Crow laws came in, they systematically stripped black people from power. During the if there's a book called Prison as an Industry that talks about the Great Migration from the South to the North, when people were migrating out the South during this Jim Crow era, looking for opportunities in the North. So because a lot of these people were displaced and were homeless, petty theft, vagrancy laws were implemented, not only to lock them up and to make, again, a cheap labor pool of labor on them prison plantations, but it also disenfranchised people from their suffrage, meaning you take away their vote, right? So remember when we talked about structural violence, these systemic practices of barring people from equitable opportunity and equitable representation? Well, what does that look like on the community level? What that looks like is the urban blight that you see within the inner city, the urban neglect, right? The high levels of lead poisoning, which Cleveland is the third highest rate of lead poisoning. Remember when we said that how they take third grade literacy scores to base how many beds to build when they project to turn 18? Well, now the data is in on how these this illiteracy is being driven a large part by the cognitive developmental delays, which are symptomatic of lead poisoning. So again, this ties in to the systematic neglect of our communities. And then there's a dominant narrative of people of color and people who are poor, right? And this dominant narrative is very hostile toward us. But also in this dominant narrative, with us feeling disenfranchised and marginalized and polarized and neglected, right? As if our voice don't matters, it's reinforced through the voter suppression. But the thing to remember is, why are they trying to suppress the vote? Why are they requiring different forms of ID for disenfranchised communities, for impacted communities, to provide? Why are they closing down all these different sites and forcing us to go to a central site? The other day, you should have seen that line out there. What street is that on, Crystal? I'm having a brain freeze. Where everybody was voting?
Euclid Avenue, Board of
Yeah,
Elections located on Euclid.
yeah. The Board of Elections on you. Man, that line was super long. So there's a reason why they're trying to stop the people from voting, because, and this is why it's so important to the students, Crystal, for them to understand, when President Obama was elected and the Republicans was studying how he generated all that money and who were the main groups that helped do this? It were the students. It was the students. It was the students using their social media platforms to get the message out, to do the motivation, to get them to get out there and vote in droves. So what did they do the next election? A lot of students vote absentee ballots, right? Well, all of a sudden, they came out and said, well, we don't want them to vote absentee ballots. They have to go into the state or the city that they're from to do their vote in person. That was an attack on student votes. So this is a conversation about power. Why do they want to suppress your vote? They want to take away your power. And Crystal, before I segue into something else, is there something else you wanted to add?
Sure. So Damien is passionate and very intelligent. That's why you can see he was a research assistant at Case. So I was also just going to mention, after the 13th comes the 14th Amendment. And it's actually the 14th Amendment of our United States Constitution that allows states to strip away the right to vote as a result of having a conviction. So the 13th Amendment says you will provide free labor and you have no rights as a citizen of the United States if you are incarcerated Black people. Remember, because this is really about, if this is for the slaves, then here's the exception to the slave rule. And then the 14th Amendment says, and if you have a conviction, we'll take away your civic opportunities and you will no longer have the right to vote. So so by revoking the voting rights, right, among other things, there's a new legal way to create slavery. It's still a slave system because all of this is about capitalism. It's not about race. The race piece is just to fool people and keep them confused so the richest of the rich can maintain their power and their riches, because money drives everything, right? So Damien talked a little bit about systematic limitations that, as a result came from the 13th and 14th Amendment, some of the Jim Crow laws, the poll taxes. He talked about some of the petty crimes, the grandfather clause, the literacy test, and then he moved you forward all the way up until 2019 and 2020, where you can still see the tricks, right? So President Barack Obama utilized these students. Well, then let's change the law and the rules around how students will be able to vote. And it's consistent, so you have to stay on top of it. One of the last pieces I wanted to be able to add to that conversation is then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the reason why I add this, because it becomes important, right? There's a congressional officer holder from the state of Ohio, right? Congresswoman Marsha Fudge, who preceded the late great Stephanie Tubbs Jones, because there would be no other, who was kind of leading the charge in the restoration of the Voting Rights Act. And this is when we begin to talk about how do you move into action and champion things. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was created to restore all the things that the 14th Amendment has stripped away. And then what do you know, right? When we talk about us in this seat and what can you do in the judicial branch of government, here comes the Supreme Court case, Richardson versus Ramirez, that upheld the rights of the Constitution to consistently disenfranchise people of their voting rights if you have been convicted of a crime. So all those things are important because the judicial branch of government did that when the legislative government tried to make an opportunity to remedy some of the past harms. So we just want to be able to give you that space and sit in it, right? And really have the big picture view of how these things are systematic in structure. They're not coincidental. They're extremely intentional about how these things are done. So power can be at its base and things can be controlled and riches and wealth can be maintained in one place. Because the reality is, if you look at most Black women in the United States of America, we are the most highly educated. We are generally doing very well on this space. We may not have the same family structure and dynamics as some of our non-white counterparts. So it's not us that actually suffer from some of these penalties that are put in place, but it is our men, it is our families, and it is our system in general. But the reason why others may have a different perception of what Black women look like, and all you see is twerking and bubblegum popping, as opposed to a Michelle Obama, right? Damien talked about being able to control the narrative through media. And what you want people to see is because it allows a non-Black American to feel dominant. And as long as a non-Black American feels dominant, they feel to see how you're all being, I don't want to curse on this webinar, but you're all being messed up by the, yes, kind of, you're being bamboozled. It's kind of being, you don't even realize you're not getting the things you should get as a citizen out of this deal, because they hold the race carrot over your head and your eyes, and you have one belief system about things that really simply are not true. And so voting, again, is the cheapest way. It is the easiest and cheapest way to begin to exercise some level of power from the ground up. It costs nothing but to organize and get boots to the ground, as we like to say it. And that's one of the reasons why, I'm sure the United States Supreme Court and those decision holders considered those things when they made they took away that opportunity to remedy the issue with the Voting Rights Act. And now you have Congresswoman Marsha Fudge kind of leading the charge. She's been in Ohio taking testimony on why we need the restoration of that act, and what pieces of it we can get back. Because unfortunately in Congress, it's ultimately always kind of a give and take games. We talked about pieces of legislation, how something is laid out for one thing, and when they say it's getting ready to pass, well, I'm going to stick this in there, and if you want it to pass, because you know how long it takes to get legislation passed, you're going to let this go, because it's always a give or take game. And that is unless or until we start to get the right people in these seats at all spaces of government, whether it be executive, legislative, or judicial. So our third question, and I'll turn it back over to Damien to answer first, is how do we activate? And they kind of started to talk about some of these things in terms of activation after he laid out a framework for you in modern day about the things that's happening, what's been produced as a result of these disparate impacts in this unjust system. So Mr. Calvert, please take it away.
Thank you. So you did a good job outlining that, Crystal. I want to share with y'all a transformational experience I've had is very germane to this conversation. In 2002 is when I learned that, as an Ohioan, that when I would be released, my suffrage would be restored, that I can vote. And that was very transformative to me because I didn't know that. Like so many of my peers, I did not know that in Ohio, we can vote when we're released. And that lifted me so much that I got involved in organizations within the prison. And I remember I didn't like the way the JCs, the Junior Chamber of Commerce, was run. I just didn't like some of the practices that the guys who were in leadership were doing. And I thought it played up to the stereotypes. And I was in the business of challenging the dominant narratives and the stereotypes of us and our level of professionalism and our potential as men doing time. And so I expressed my displeasure, and the brothers told me, said, man, get involved, man, elections are coming up. And I did. And I had to articulate the change that I would like to see and that I would initiate if given the opportunity within that organization. And that was my first taste of civic engagement, even while incarcerated. And it motivated me so much that the NAACP's national branch was starting its prison branches under the 7 prison project tenets of the NAACP. And I read them, and I got authorization to start a steering committee. And once we got the number of members we needed to apply for our charter, we applied for our charter, and then that's how I became the inaugural president. And the first thing I did was began to identify those men who were getting ready to go home within 60 days and began to not only register them to vote, but invite professionals in and people from the community and civic leaders to come in and talk about the issues of the day, to talk about judges, to talk about council people, to listen to the news and read the papers for people who talked about issues that were important to us, that represented our interests, that represented the change in this mass incarceration piece. And so and talking about giving returning citizens a second chance when they come home to work and to stabilize into the community. And that was a lot of power. And so when I came home, I immediately got involved and was part of the Ohio organizing campaign. And there's something I want to share with you about this transformational lesson I learned. I shared with you earlier in the conversation about being a subject matter expert, which all of us are. And one of my subject matter expertise was reentry and was motivating my peers, looking at the issues that the judges stand on, that council people stood on, and then talking and engaging my peers on this and mobilizing them to vote. I was a part of the voter effort during the second run of President Obama. And I was an Obama enthusiast because at that time, because just seeing a person of color in that highest office just opened me up to possibilities. And I was able to get people to come out and vote. some numbers, as we say. And that's what gave me value. That's what put me on the radar of certain civic leaders that put me in different positions, being able to articulate these issues. Once I got a taste of this, it was very empowering. And as I said, this is a question about building power. When we talk about voting, and when we talk about them trying to block our votes, them creating all these little stupid little policies to strangle our vote or to make it so tedious with the hope that we'll lose patience with it and drop out and just say forget it, that shows you that the power we have, because they're trying to block you from exercising it. And so you students who are so smart, who understands social media platforms, one of the things that you can begin to do now is to first educate yourself on the issues. Educate yourself on the politics of the candidates that's running. You are so good at doing Google searches and Siri searches of different topics and things. Do that to these people that's running for position. Study the issues like you have to study for a test. What side of it do you stand on? How is it impacting you? Understand your personal narrative. So for example, I shared with you that there's a dominant narrative. There's definitely a dominant narrative of me being an African American. There's a dominant narrative of me as a felon. And in that narrative, the label, the lie of the label becomes you, so to speak. So the first step in moving forward and claiming my own power was claiming my own narrative. What's your personal narratives, right? And the black in the backdrop of all this conflict and political tensions and all of this, what is your personal narrative, and how can you use that story itself, your personal story about how you feel about what's going on and what you're learning about the issue, and the conversations that you're having with your peers becomes a story of you, a story of self, to a story of us collectively, how you feel you're being impacted, not just as a student body, but as young ladies and young men who are going to inherit this machine. And what kind of changes do you want to see, and what candidates are best talking about these changes, and use your social media platforms to rally others to get out to vote on the candidates you feel best represent your issue. And sometimes, you know, it is a choice between a lesser of evils, but a choice not to vote is still a choice too. Two, for those of you, three, for those of you who are like seriously interested on what it means to build power, to not only claim your vote, but to get the message out and to build student coalitions around this, and to really motivate people into action, into voting. If you are interested in taking a deeper dive into that, like what does that look like? Let me know. Let your professor know. She has my information. Let me know. I have partners in my networks who does this type of training, who will I've already talked to them, who will allow you, help you, enable you to take a deeper dive into what does building power look like through the get out the vote piece, through voting, and not just voting singularly, but voting in numbers. If you're really interested in moving that forward, let me know. I would love to tie you into the people so that you can get this additional training on how to use your platforms, how to use your voice, how to use your camaraderie, how to team build around your peers to like create a real movement.
Thank you, Mr. Calvert. I love the passion and motivation around the discussion point. And so again, I'll kind of frame some of the things that Mr. Calvert said, and certainly the invitation is extended to myself as well. Ms. Miller, or Dean Miller, has my information if you all have questions after the fact that you can't think of, or they don't resonate until you're done with this discussion because you've had time to reflect on it. Please touch bases with the both of us, and we'd be happy to support or answer in any way that we possibly can. So Mr. Calvert touched on the fact that, in fact, you know, his right to vote is restored, right? So I just want to make sure, again, right, we're talking law. I can't help myself. So every now and then the lawyer in me comes out, but not often. General rule, right? So the general rule is, in the state of Ohio, you do have the right to vote if you're a formerly incarcerated person. all you have to do the minute you are released from a correctional institution is re-register. That's in the state of Ohio. That's not specific to Cuyahoga County. We have 88 counties. That is in the entire state of Ohio, right? So that means if you have somebody on probation, right, and people go to probation when they go to probation to prevent them from ever serving a sentence. So they're given a second chance. They're given conditions and stipulations, and so long as they don't violate, they never enter into a correctional facility, right? So if you're on probation, you can still vote. If you're on parole, parole means you're on your way home from a correctional facility. You have some level of supervision to help you reintegrate into the community. Some level of support from one of our state offices. And the minute you get out, right, you're on parole, you are allowed to vote. If you are in a halfway house, so some of you may not know what a halfway house is, it's usually a private community-based correctional facility. It's like a step down when you leave the correctional setting and you're transitioning back into the community, and you may need some added supports in terms of a living environment for a while. So there are some tricky things around halfway houses though. If you're a federal inmate, so if you're under the jurisdiction of the federal government in a halfway house, you are not allowed to vote because technically you are still an inmate of that federal institution. And if you're a state inmate, meaning you are under the auspices or agency of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, you're still technically an inmate in a halfway house. But if you've been sentenced there as a parole violation or probation violation inside the halfway house, then you are allowed to vote inside of the halfway house. And lastly, you are allowed to vote while you are actually incarcerated inside of our local jails. So we have 14 municipalities. There are some municipal jails, and then we have our larger county jail. And the reason you may ask, well, you just said an inmate couldn't vote. Well, technically, you are not an inmate inside of a Cuyahoga County jail. You are being temporarily held unless you are convicted of the offense already. Now, once you are convicted, if you're just awaiting time to be shipped up to one of the state institutions or a federal institution, you are technically now an inmate. You've lost that agency over yourself. But if you are awaiting a sentence, if you're awaiting a trial, so sometimes people can be held because of people and the community perceives them as a threat. I've seen people held for a year, right? And they with no conviction. So if you're held in that space, or you simply could not make the or meet the financial responsibility for bond, you could be held. So there are a multitude of reasons that could keep someone inside of an institution without a conviction. And if that's the case, you can in fact still vote while you are inside of a jail. You have not been sentenced yet for the offense. So basically, general rule, you can vote. All you got to do is re-register on your way out. And if you're on probation or parole while in a halfway house or in the community, you also have the right to vote as well.
Absolutely.
Make sure those things are clear. And then we want to talk about ways to activate, right? So Damien talked to you about the organized and peace. And so, you know, you may not even think it's strong in you depending on where you are in your career. I've obviously taken a non-traditional career path in terms of being an attorney. And you never know where things are going to take you in this space. You may decide the practice of law is not for you, but I'll never be upset, or I'll never regret the decision to go to law school. There's certain things that it teaches you about how to analyze, critically think, and organize that will make you better than any other organizer you probably ever met before. Because all law teaches you, well, law school teaches you strategy. The bar exam prepares you to practice law, but law school gives you the strategy to make this happen, right? And so when you think about strategy, there are various things you can do in addition to the things that Damien talked about, right? You can decide to activate yourself in a more formal setting. You can contact your congressional office. You can voice your opinion on these matters. You can voice your concerns about laws. You can voice your concerns about voting rights for the other states where there are still tons of disenfranchisements, unlike Ohio, because we're really fortunate in this space, right? You can also get involved in terms of being an observer. So when I was in law school, this is a nonpartisan discussion. My role and my job is nonpartisan. You have to make a disclaimer, but I was the president of the Democratic Law Organization. Not sure if it still exists at Cleveland Marshall. And so you can activate in that way. And what we did is we worked with the parties to ensure that if they wanted additional observers and they wanted law students, it's a good way to network and begin to kind of build your community network up, which ultimately helps you land a role. But it's also a good way to get experience, right? Really studying what your role is, what you have the capacity to do by law or policy, and really getting engaged in ensuring that people's rights are not violated. And now more than ever, there's a space and a need for that. You make a plan. So even when you're thinking about voting or strategy, make your own plan to vote, right? Damien talked about the line being wrapped around the corner. Well, we're really fortunate that we have early voting. So that's what he's mentioning. Early voting started October 6th. Let's see, when does it end? It ends November 2nd. Those who want to vote in person and not at the place assigned to you by the Board of Elections, which may be some school or whatever place they assign, you are allowed to vote early at the Board of Elections. But he did say there's a line around, you know, the wall. It's a positive thing In some cases, because so many people are now afraid to vote by mail, or what we sometimes call voting at home. I vote at home. I love voting at home. It's not too late to still request your ballot to vote at home, but if that is the plan you have for yourself, you need to get it done immediately. Ballots
Before
begin.
the 27th.
Yep. Ballots begin to be mailed out October 6th. As soon as you get your ballot in, please feel free to drop it off in person if you are struggling with trusting our current postal system. So you can drop your ballot off in a mailbox, what they call a drop box, in the back of the Board of Elections in a parking lot, 2925 Euclid Avenue. But ultimately, there are a multitude of ways. You decide on your decision and your network and where you want to be in terms of strategy, and you make it work for you. But we all have very unique talents, and you must do something in terms of this democracy that we also love and we want to see be maintained.
Absolutely.
Damien, is there
Absolutely.
anything else you want to add to this discussion before we turn it back over to Amy?
I'm anxious to hear from some of the students. I'll just say that I had the wonderful honor and learning experience to work with the Ohio Student Association some years back, and to see those enthusiastic souls taking on different political issues, and fighting to make sure that their interests and their concerns was part of the not only the Ohio but the national discourse was really lifting. And again, I want to encourage students to get involved. This is not a spectator sport. This is a full contact sport, and whether you like it or not, you're going to have to take your place in the machine. And why not be proactive in helping and to shape it more favorably, so that when you take your former place in it, it resembles more of your values. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the students.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions from the students, so I'll address those. The first one is directed at Damien, and it asks about how they have read, this particular student has really read that many men and women while in prison become very politically active and connected, and they'd like to know, what does that look like, and what are the resources available to those incarcerated while they're incarcerated to stay engaged in the political process?
Okay, well, what happens is for those who are locked up that become really proactive in their own self-development and wanting to understand how, they fell into that position, they become very political, because you see that, for instance, with me, um, I began to see systematically that there were so many people of color there, and I'm like, why does this color scheme off? One, right? And two, I did time in juvenile. I was in group homes and foster homes. I was in a children's home. I was in Buckeye Youth Center and Coggy Hills Boys School. And I remember one of the things that triggered me was all these young men that I was locked up with. How did we all end up in prison? And beginning to study it, you really see that it was intentional. Like, you learn about the 13th Amendment. You see the end result. You see many of your options was colored for you. We when you come from certain depressed communities, you can see how circumstances are engineered for you to make bad decisions. Like, you can see it plain as day. And so many people, are appalled by that. And for those of us who was involved in doing things that was harmful to ourselves and to our community and harmed others, we're appalled at our actions. And so there's a desire that's sired in you to kind of want, like in my instance, to rebuild and to repair what I once had a hand in destroying. And so that drive strives you to learn, to reconcile with your God, whatever you call your God, to become a change agent. And there's something in you that, for instance, in Cleveland State, as a side note, when I went to Cleveland State, I noticed that the people who were studying nonprofit administration like me, and the case managers that was in the School of Social Work, Many of them came from prison. Many of them come from sordid backgrounds, drug abuse, all of that. But the common denominator was that all of us sought to improve our communities, to help others who are going through that, or to stop people from having to go through that. I think that is just a natural consequence of having gone through that type of journey. It just inspires you to not only want to do better and be better, but to invest in your village and the people in the village. And so you said, what does that look like? How do you do that? Well, you read. You know, they do have books in prison, and it opens up worlds. Literally, it opens up worlds. I think was it Frederick Douglass that says education is your passport to the future. It gave me the tools to re-envision and reimagine my life outside of prison. It gave me the tools to identify the things I was passionate about and to become a subject matter expert on these particular things. And so that's what happens in prison. You know, it's in that school of hard knocks that your metal get tested in ways that you really learn who you are and what you are. And so and that happens in many challenges. I know personally women who've had breast cancer who in that life and death struggle and then wanting to live, like the outcome of that, they became a better human being, you know. And so like um there's many ways, and it's like part of your individual it's like part of your individual journey, like how you carry the cross of a life sentence or the cross of that challenge that you bear. That's your individual journey, but you can harvest those lessons in ways that add value and dignity to your life and to the people you seek to positively impact through those lessons. And so I can really go on, but again, I'd like to offer my information up, ma'am, that if anybody's like really interested in figuring out how to engage like that or learn more, I would definitely open myself up to have that discussion. So feel free to pass my information out, please.
Will do. Thanks, Damien. Another question for both of you is which is related to just what you said, Damien. What are some advocacy groups or organizations, locally right now, even though right now Ohio has one of the better opportunities for formerly incarcerated to vote right after they are released, but many states don't have those rights. So are there any local organizations or national advocacy groups that students ought to learn more about if they'd like to work on this, if they're maybe not from Ohio, or if they, just would like to help nationally?
Yeah, so I'll tackle it first and turn it back over to Damien. Damien mentioned some, right? And you see in the chat, I realize it's kind of jumbled. You can't really see, it's not hyperlinking, that there are a multitude of local organizations in which you can get engaged or get involved with. So one is called the FIMPAC. The acronym stands for the Formerly Incarcerated Political Action Committee, ran by a gentleman by the name of Fred Ward, who also spent a significant amount of years being incarcerated in a state institution. Phenomenal man, tons of civic engagement experience, parts of a multitude of movements throughout the city of Cleveland and help prosper those who are impoverished. A second one, which is a new one, is actually based out of Akron, but they work a lot in the Cleveland space and is led by a gentleman named, Ray's last name slips me, but his first name's Ray.
Green.
Right, there you go. And he runs the Freedom Block. And the Freedom Block is also, he was formerly incarcerated as well, spent a significant amount of time, and is a very busy gentleman in this space, organizing and advocating for not just candidates, but also issue areas and things that impact those who are directly impacted in the local space. So he comes into Cleveland a lot, always willing to champion some stuff. And then a national organization I would suggest you all get involved with or search. Research is Just Leadership. So Just Leadership is a national organization founded by Glenn Martin, and it's based out of New York. I was a lucky 2019 cohort member, and that was just by way of the fact that they began to allow people who were directly impacted but not actually incarcerated to be a part of this leadership training development model. They currently have an advocacy action webinar series that brings truth to power for those who are formerly incarcerated, and they have different action items and agendas and preps you and prepares you to speak in front of legislators and build advocacy tools in terms of their network. Ray is a fellow too. I think he actually was in the inaugural class maybe 10 years ago at this point. The organization is ran by Deanna Hoskins. Deanna was the former director of our Hamilton County Office of Reentry in Cincinnati. So it's a phenomenal organization for you to understand and get involved with. And then we put a link up God bless Amy because she knows how to do it right, to represent justice. So a lot of the factual history, well, I know it in my head. So when I try to read off paper the actual numbers, this is which kind of got me a little jaded. A lot of that background today comes directly off of them summarizing for you how this all interrelates. It gives you data, it gives you facts, it gives you figures, you can get handouts, and it's all about the directly impacted populations experiencing this space and how you can get involved. So those are two nationals, two locals, and then we still have our ACLU, and we have our Reentry Leadership Coalition that has a policy and advocacy subcommittee in which Damien serves as tri-chair alongside Councilman Blaine Griffin and Health and Human Services Director David Merriman. So there are plenty of ways for you to get involved, ask additional questions, and reach out. And just note too, some of the small things is language, and you guys know that as attorneys or soon to be attorneys. So you notice we've never said ex-offender on this phone, and you listen to Damien rate himself as a person for an action that he did, and the language is really important. So one piece of advocacy is to never call people ex-offenders, be able to treat them as human beings. Make sure you put it in your mind, these are human beings who made a mistake or have some additional action attached to them that was in the past. I mean, the more you do that, the more we begin to change the perception of the world, which is a huge deal.
Absolutely. Crystal, thank you so much for that. Language matters. And it's important to understand the lie of the label, because if you consent to the label, then and the person who was putting the label on you consents to it, and you consent to the label that's put on you, then people react to the label and not you, the human being, and your journey is eclipsed. So you always remember the lie of the label. And so thank you, Crystal, for sharing that, because that's actually who I was going to share. I called Fred Ward, who is head of FinPAC, and he has a center on East 105 called the Kanimu Center. And in that, they offer trainings, and they also offer trainings via Zoom. And so I spoke with him before this phone call because one of the things was to offer something tangible, a tangible action item. And so the reason why I had said, anybody who's like really interested in taking a deeper dive to that, I've already spoke with Fred Ward concerning that. All of those who are interested, I will personally be linking you with Fred Ward, with his Kanimu Center, to lock you into those trainings on building power, civic engagement. And there's a lot of history in that. You'll learn just the difference between a precinct leader and a ward leader and a council person, and in those areas how if you really want to see real change in real time, those are the positions that you really want to impact. Whether you want to hold one yourself and you run for them positions, or hold the people in those positions accountable, because them are the positions where the rubber meet the road. And and the insight into that like revolutionized my thinking on what power is, because we think a mayor, a president, a representative, or a council person. Nah, there's power right here that's tangible that we can reach and touch. So again, get in touch with me, and I've already had Fred's consent to pipeline you right into them trainings. Oh, and Ray Green and them, I worked with them when I was a movement builder organizer for the Ohio Organizing Campaign. They were a part of that, part of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, where we worked on a lot of social and economic justice issues, and voter registration, and suffrage, and mass incarceration, and all of that ties in together. It's interconnected and interrelated.
Well, thank you. I want to thank both Crystal and Damien. I think this has just been an incredible presentation and really illuminating, and I hope for all of our students listening today. So I want to thank both you, Crystal, and Damien. I can't thank you enough for doing this. And I want to remind everyone, I just I'm going to put it down right now, my email. Make sure you write it down, because it's not the awesomest one, right? There's a lot of A. Millers at CSU. So A.L.Miller86 at csuohio.edu. reach out to me or just reach out to our admission office, and we'll connect you with either Damien or Crystal if you'd like to speak with them further or learn a little bit more about their activities. And before I let them go, I just want to reiterate to both of them how much we appreciate it, and to each of you, voting is really, really important. It is the most important power you have. And so I did vote today. I went to the Board of Elections and voted in person. I didn't plan that for this presentation, but I want to highlight that since they both mentioned it. The line actually wasn't terrible, and I am used to voting in person at the Board of Elections because, as Crystal well knows, Cleveland State University is only about 6 blocks from the Board of Elections, so I would go at my lunch hour regularly and always vote early, and I really enjoyed it. So I wanted to do it again today. So I strongly encourage you, no matter what county you're in, no matter what state you're in, you really need to vote this year, and frankly every year. I mean, this year is in the news a lot, but I want to be clear that it is also really, really important every single election, because local leaders, state leaders, and national leaders impact your life on a day-to-day basis, even if you don't think they do. So you really need to become educated and vote. So on that note, I want to thank Damien and Crystal again. And Damien just put his email down there, and his phone number, but you can still reach out to me. I'll make sure that I keep that so that I can provide that information to you guys as well. But thank you, and I want to wish you a great evening and a good weekend coming up. I hope it's as beautiful weather as Damien's display is showing all weekend. I hope we all have a beautiful sunshiny weekend. So I'll see everyone later. Thank you again. And please, for all of you, join us on our other webinars at the same calendar that you registered for this one. We'll have lots of different events available. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.